For 26 years, Sharon Hammock's name lived only in a case file. A mother of two, pregnant with her third child, found wrapped in an electric blanket on a Kent County roadside in 1996. No witnesses, no confessions. Just DNA preserved in a vial, waiting for science to catch up with justice. When genetic genealogy finally spoke, it whispered a truck driver's name and shattered a community's silence forever. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The autumn morning hung still over Kent County, Michigan, like a held breath waiting to be released. September 1996 painted the rural landscape in muted browns and fading greens, where cornfields stretched toward distant farmhouses and two-lane roads carved through countryside that seemed untouched by urban chaos. Highway workers arrived early to clear debris from the shoulder of County Road 37, a quiet back road that served mostly local traffic and the occasional lost traveler. What they found that Tuesday morning would haunt Kent County for decades to come. The bundle sat too neat against the tree line, an electric blanket wrapped tight around something that didn't belong among the fallen leaves and scattered litter. Its floral pattern, pale blue roses on cream fabric, was incongruous among the natural decay of early autumn. One worker approached cautiously, his boots crunching through frost-brittle grass, then stumbled backward as recognition dawned and horror flooded his consciousness. Inside the blanket lay a woman, bound and lifeless, her face peaceful despite the violence that had claimed her life. Her dark hair spilled across the makeshift shroud, and rope marks circled her wrists like cruel jewelry. She appeared young, perhaps late 20s, with the kind of quiet beauty that spoke of gentleness and vulnerability. Within an hour, Kent County Sheriff's deputies had cordoned off the scene with yellow tape that fluttered in. The morning breeze, like prayer flags marking sacred ground. Detective arrived first, scanning the roadside with practiced eyes that had seen too much death in rural places. The isolation was perfect for someone who needed privacy for dark work. No houses within a quarter mile, no witnesses to unwanted activities. The medical examiner knelt beside the bundle, documenting every detail with methodical precision. Camera flashes punctuated the quiet morning. As evidence was photographed from multiple angles, the woman's hands showed faint rope marks, evidence of restraint. Most troubling of all, her abdomen suggested she was several months pregnant, adding another layer of tragedy to an already horrific discovery. Dumped here sometime during the night, the medical examiner observed quietly, voice carrying the weight of professional detachment that masked deeper emotion. But she wasn't killed here. No blood on the asphalt, no signs of struggle. This is a disposal site, not a crime. Too seen. Detective nodded grimly, noting the killer's calculated approach. Transportation from another location suggested planning and familiarity with the area's geography. The electric blanket indicated domesticity, perhaps intimacy. This wasn't random street violence, but something more personal and therefore more chilling. News of the discovery spread through Kent County like ripples in still water. Radio stations reported a body found on County Road 37. Coffee shop conversations turned somber. Fear crept into ordinary discussions as residents processed the reality that violence had visited their quiet corner of Michigan. Dawn broke fully over the crime scene as investigators processed every inch of roadway with forensic thoroughness. The medical examiner worked methodically, photographing rope fibers still clinging to the victim's wrists and documenting evidence that would wait decades for its moment of revelation. Detective coordinated with the evidence team, ensuring nothing was overlooked in what might be their only chance to capture crucial details. The electric blanket drew particular attention from forensic specialists. Its pattern and fabric suggested recent purchase, possibly from a department store chain. Individual fibers were carefully collected with tweezers and sealed in evidence bags, labeled with precise handwriting that would be read by future investigators not yet born. The blanket's domestic nature was unsettling. It spoke of home, comfort, and warmth being perverted into an instrument of concealment. No defensive wounds on her hands, the medical examiner noted, dictating observations to a handheld recorder. Fingernails are clean, no skin beneath them. She was likely restrained before any violence occurred. The binding was systematic, professional. Despite the limited forensic capabilities available in 1996, the investigative team collected DNA samples with meticulous care that exceeded standard protocols. Detective insisted on preservation procedures that seemed excessive to some colleagues, but would prove crucial decades later. Swabs were taken from multiple locations, sealed in sterile containers, and stored according to protocols designed for evidence that might not be analyzed for years. Local radio crackled with updates as news of the discovery spread beyond law enforcement circles. Residents gathered in small groups outside grocery stores and gas stations, their conversations mixing curiosity with genuine fear. Women who lived alone began checking their locks twice before bed. Parents kept closer watch on teenage daughters who might be vulnerable to predators. "We're dealing with someone organized," detective told the assembled investigative team during a briefing that afternoon. "This isn't a crime of passion or opportunity. The location was chosen deliberately. The transportation suggests planning. The careful wrapping indicates someone who's thought through the process of disposal." The implications were sobering. Organized killers were harder to catch, more likely to repeat their crimes, and often mobile enough to avoid detection across multiple jurisdictions. This might not be an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that had yet to be recognized. As the victim was prepared for transport to the county morgue, investigators began the painstaking work of canvassing nearby properties. Someone had seen something. Someone always did. The question was whether they realized what they had witnessed, and whether they would remember details that could prove crucial to solving a puzzle that was already growing more complex. The sterile fluorescent lights of the county morgue cast harsh illumination over truth in its rawest form. The medical examiner worked with clinical precision, documenting evidence that would speak across decades when called upon to testify. Every observation was recorded, every photograph carefully labeled, every sample preserved with the understanding that science would eventually advance beyond current limitations. Strangulation marks circled the victim's neck, precise, controlled pressure, applied with deadly efficiency. The killer had known exactly what they were doing. This wasn't fumbling amateur work, but the calculated violence of someone with experience. The fetus, estimated at 24 weeks gestation, had been developing normally until that September night, when 2 lives were extinguished in moments of calculated brutality. No signs of sexual assault were immediately apparent, though comprehensive analysis would require laboratory examination. DNA samples were collected with extraordinary care from multiple locations on the victim's body. The medical examiner understood that 1996's forensic limitations might not be permanent. Science advanced in unexpected directions. Cold cases reopened when technology caught up with preserved evidence. Rope fibers under her fingernails. The medical examiner dictated to the recorder, voice steady despite the emotional weight of the examination, consistent with binding restraints, applied ante-mortem. Victim appears to have been transported post-mortem, based on lividity patterns and absence of blood at the discovery site. The examination revealed additional details that painted a picture of careful planning and execution. Fabric transfers from the electric blanket were found on the victim's clothing. Soil samples from multiple locations suggested the body had been moved at least twice before final disposal. Trace evidence included fibers that might eventually link to a suspect's clothing or vehicle. Though such analysis was beyond current technological capabilities, detective observed from the gallery, absorbing details that would be referenced countless times in future reports and court proceedings. This wasn't a crime of passion driven by momentary rage. This was predatory calculation executed with disturbing competence. How long can we preserve the DNA samples under optimal conditions? Detective asked, already thinking beyond current investigative limitations. Indefinitely, if stored at proper temperatures with appropriate protocols, the medical examiner replied, understanding the implication. Though I'm not certain when the technology will exist to extract meaningful results from such limited samples. Neither could imagine it would take 26 years for science to catch up with justice. Neither could foresee the technological revolution that would eventually give voice to victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The neighborhood canvass revealed Kent County's rural isolation in stark detail. Deputies knocked on doors separated by acres of farmland, finding residents whose quiet lives had been undisturbed by unusual activity during the crucial overnight hours. The sparse population that provided perfect cover for criminal activity also meant fewer potential witnesses to crucial events. An elderly farmer who lived 3/4 of a mile from the disposal site recalled hearing a heavy truck engine around midnight, but the sound hadn't seemed unusual enough to investigate. Highway traffic was common even on back roads, as delivery trucks and long-haul drivers sought shortcuts between major routes. The farmer's hearing wasn't what it used to be, and he'd been watching late-night television when the sound occurred. A convenience store clerk working the overnight shift remembered a woman matching the victim's general description, purchasing cigarettes and coffee 2 weeks prior, but the memory was too vague for reliable identification. Hundreds of customers passed through the store weekly. Security cameras from that period had already been reused, their footage lost to routine operations. Detective focused investigative attention on truck stops and motels, within a 50-mile radius of the discovery site. The perpetrator had demonstrated mobility and familiarity with local geography, suggesting someone whose work or lifestyle involved regular travel through the region. Long-haul truckers, delivery drivers, construction workers, and other transient professionals became persons of interest in an investigation that was already showing signs of complexity beyond local resources. Fear began reshaping the community's daily rhythms in subtle but noticeable ways. Women avoided walking alone after dark, even in neighborhoods where such caution had never seemed necessary. Parents kept closer watch on teenage children who might be vulnerable to predators. Hardware stores reported increased sales of deadbolt locks and security systems. "We've had 3 similar cases in the past 2 years," detective confided to a fellow investigator during a quiet moment in the station. Women found in isolated locations, all transported post-mortem from unknown primary crime scenes, all living on society's margins, where their disappearances might not prompt immediate searches. The pattern suggested a predator who selected vulnerable victims with calculating precision, women whose deaths might generate minimal media attention, whose investigations might receive limited resources, whose stories might be forgotten by a society that preferred not to acknowledge their existence. As evening approached, detective prepared for the most difficult conversation of any investigation, notifying a family that their loved one had been found under circumstances that would haunt them forever. Dental records confirmed what DNA would later prove definitively and beyond any possibility of doubt. The victim was Sharon Hammock, 29 years old, mother of 2 young children, pregnant with her 3rd child when violence found her on a September night that should have been like any other. Her family had reported her missing 3 days earlier, when she failed to return home from what they thought was a routine errand. Detectives sat in the department's cramped interview room with Sharon's parents, delivering news that no family should ever hear. The institutional green walls and fluorescent lighting seemed to amplify the weight of words that would forever divide their lives into before and after this moment. Sharon's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, their grief filling the small space with unbearable weight that pressed against everyone present. She was trying to get her life together, her father said through tears that had been building since the moment police knocked on their door. The pregnancy was giving her hope. She was talking about getting clean, finding steady work, being the mother her children deserved. She wanted to break the cycle. Sharon's struggle with addiction had led to survival choices that placed her in dangerous situations, but her love for her children remained the constant center of her existence. She had been working toward stability through local support programs, attending meetings, and planning for the future when violence intercepted her journey toward redemption. Detective learned that Sharon had been seen near the Crossroads truck stop the night she disappeared. Multiple witnesses described her talking to a man beside a semi-trailer in the parking lot's shadows, though darkness and distance had obscured identifying details. The lead seemed promising until investigators realized the truck stop served hundreds of drivers weekly, with constant turnover that made identification nearly impossible. Medical records from the county health clinic confirmed Sharon's pregnancy and documented her recent efforts to access prenatal care despite financial limitations. She had been preparing for motherhood with the dedication of someone who understood the precious nature of the opportunity. The tragic irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the investigation. She had been fighting for life when death found her. "We'll find who did this to Sharon," detective promised her family, though the words felt hollow against the magnitude of their loss. "She won't be forgotten. This case will stay active until we have answers." That promise would define the investigation's legacy and test the limits of institutional patience across decades of uncertainty. Evening fell over the Hammock family home like a shroud, casting long shadows across rooms that would never feel quite safe again. Detective delivered additional details that helped family members understand their daughter's final days while struggling to process grief that seemed too large for human hearts to contain. Sharon's parents sat on their worn couch, surrounded by photographs covering nearby tables, images of birthdays, holidays, school plays, and precious moments now transformed into memorials. Sharon was gentle with everyone she met, her mother whispered, holding a picture of Sharon with her 2 young children at last Christmas. She made mistakes, but those babies were her world. She loved them more than life itself. She was trying so hard to be better, to give them the stability she'd never had. The family's grief was complicated by shame and societal judgment that had shadowed Sharon's struggles. Her involvement in sex work had been born of desperation rather than choice, a survival mechanism in a world that offered few alternatives to women battling addiction and poverty. The circumstances that had made her vulnerable to predators now threatened to overshadow her humanity and death. Detective assured them of a thorough investigation, though privately acknowledged the case's mounting challenges. Physical evidence was limited to what had been preserved at the scene. Witnesses were scarce, and their memories already fading. The killer had demonstrated sophistication that suggested experience with violence and familiarity with investigative procedures. Local media coverage remained minimal. A brief paragraph in the county paper noting another body found along rural roadways, without mentioning Sharon's name or circumstances. Her death joined a growing list of similar cases that generated little public concern or institutional pressure for resolution. The disparity in attention reflected uncomfortable truths about whose deaths mattered to society at large. Missing suburban mothers prompted massive search parties and sustained media campaigns. Missing women struggling with addiction and poverty received case numbers, file folders, and the dutiful but limited attention of overworked investigators. Sharon's mother's voice carried quiet dignity as she made a request that would echo through decades. Promise me she won't be forgotten. Promise me someone will remember that she was more than her mistakes. She was a daughter, a mother, a person who deserved to live. That promise would drive detectives' commitment to preserving evidence with unusual care and maintaining hope when logic suggested surrender. Detectives' systematic review of similar cases across the region revealed a chilling pattern emerging throughout the Midwest, like a shadow stretching across multiple jurisdictions. Women found in isolated locations, all transported post-mortem from unknown primary crime scenes, all sharing the economic vulnerability and social marginalization that made them perfect victims for a calculating predator. In Grand Rapids, 3 unsolved murders matched Sharon's case profile with disturbing consistency. In neighboring counties, 2 additional bodies had been discovered under circumstances that seemed almost identical: rural disposal sites, careful transport, binding methods that suggested single perpetrator with developing expertise. The geographic spread indicated mobility on a scale that suggested interstate commerce or long-haul transportation. Someone whose legitimate work provided cover for illegitimate activities. Someone who could move between jurisdictions before local investigations gained momentum. DNA evidence existed in 2 of the related cases, but 1996's forensic limitations prevented meaningful analysis beyond basic blood typing. The samples were preserved alongside Sharon's, waiting for science to evolve beyond current capabilities. Evidence rooms across 3 counties contained pieces of a puzzle that wouldn't be solvable for decades. Detective contacted investigators in surrounding counties, sharing details and comparing notes in conversations that revealed the scope of potential serial violence. A multi-jurisdictional task force was discussed, but never formalized, due to bureaucratic complexities and resource constraints that made cooperation difficult, despite obvious need. Public attention remained minimal, despite the emerging pattern of violence. Victims were perceived as having high-risk lifestyles, language that minimized their humanity while providing convenient explanation for their deaths. Society found it easier to blame victims than confront the reality of predators who exploited. Social indifference. The investigation's momentum began slowing as initial leads dried up and new cases demanded attention. Detective continued working Sharon's file during off hours, but department priorities shifted toward crimes with better clearance prospects and less complicated social dynamics. Evidence was carefully cataloged and stored in climate-controlled conditions that exceeded standard procedures. Detective insisted on preservation protocols, motivated by an instinct that this case would eventually find its resolution, though the timeline remained unknowable. Time would become both enemy and ally in the long pursuit of justice for Sharon Hammock. Years blurred into decades as Sharon's case joined thousands of others in cold case files that filled storage rooms and digital databases with the accumulated weight of unsolved mysteries. Detective retired in 2008, replaced by younger investigators who inherited boxes of evidence and fading hopes that had sustained their predecessor through countless frustrating dead ends. The DNA samples remained frozen in time, stored in specialized facilities that maintained optimal conditions for evidence that might someday speak when technology caught up with preserved truth. Laboratory advances accelerated through the 2000s, but limited budgets prevented routine re-examination of archived cases unless specific circumstances justified the expense. Sharon's family marked birthdays and anniversaries, shadowed by unanswered questions that grew heavier with each passing year. Her children, now teenagers, struggled with the burden of growing up without knowing who had killed their mother, or why. Therapy sessions and support groups provided limited comfort against the persistent ache of unresolved trauma. The single cold case detective, assigned to review archived files during budget-mandated inventory, discovered Sharon's case in 2018, noting the unusual care with which evidence had been preserved. Chain of custody documentation was meticulous. Storage conditions had been optimal. The DNA samples remained viable after more than 2 decades. Genetic genealogy was revolutionizing forensic investigation, enabling investigators to trace DNA through family trees and public databases with precision that seemed almost magical to veteran investigators. Cases considered permanently unsolvable were suddenly yielding suspects and convictions that vindicated decades of patient evidence preservation. Detectives' successors submitted Sharon's DNA samples to Identifinders International, a genetic genealogy company specializing in forensic applications. The process would require months of painstaking analysis, but hope flickered for the first time since 1996. Community members who remembered Sharon's case wondered if justice might finally emerge from decades of silence. Her children, now adults with families of their own, dared to imagine their mother's killer might someday face consequences for violence that had shaped their entire lives. Technology had preserved what time nearly destroyed the possibility that truth could emerge from even the longest silence. By 2019, genetic genealogy had become law enforcement's most powerful tool for solving cold cases that had resisted traditional investigative methods. The DNA sample from Sharon's 1996 murder was submitted to specialized laboratories capable of extracting meaningful results from evidence that had been considered too degraded for previous analysis. Identifinders International began the painstaking process of mapping genetic connections across public genealogy databases that contained millions of family trees submitted by individuals seeking their heritage. Partial matches emerged slowly, pointing toward complex family relationships that spread across the Midwest like roots of an enormous tree. The breakthrough came through third-cousin connections that traced back through generations of marriages, migrations, and family stories preserved in digital records. Computer algorithms processed thousands of potential relationships, narrowing possibilities until one name emerged with startling clarity: Gary Dean Artman, a long-haul truck driver whose roots and timeline aligned perfectly with the pattern of unsolved murders. Detectives researched Artman's background with growing excitement tempered by professional caution. His employment records showed regular runs through Michigan during the mid-1990s, including documented stops at facilities near Sharon's last known location. His personal history included arrests for domestic violence and assault charges that painted a picture of escalating aggression toward women. The genetic match was compelling but required confirmation through direct DNA comparison that would provide courtroom-ready evidence. Detectives began surveillance operations, waiting for an opportunity to obtain a fresh sample that would either confirm or eliminate Artman as a suspect. After 23 years of silence, Sharon's case was no longer cold. It was burning toward resolution with intensity that energized investigators who had never expected to see justice emerge from such an old investigation. The pursuit of truth was entering its final phase, though the path ahead remained uncertain. Modern science had given voice to evidence that had waited decades for the technology to translate its message into justice for Sharon Hammock and her family. Gary Dean Artman's life history painted a disturbing portrait of mobility, violence, and predatory behavior that aligned with investigative theories about Sharon's killer. Employment records traced his trucking routes across 6 states, creating a geographic pattern that corresponded with unsolved murders of vulnerable women in locations where his legitimate work provided perfect cover for illegitimate activities. His criminal background revealed a progression of increasingly serious offenses that suggested escalating violence over time. Domestic violence arrests in 3 states had resulted in brief jail terms and restraining orders that he violated repeatedly. Assault charges in 2 jurisdictions had been dropped when victims refused to testify, likely intimidated into silence by someone who understood how to manipulate the legal system. A sexual assault case in Ohio had been dismissed on technical grounds when evidence was ruled inadmissible due to procedural errors. The victim had described her attacker as a truck driver who had seemed familiar with the area despite claiming to be passing through. Her testimony, preserved in case files, matched details from Sharon's investigation with chilling accuracy. Detectives reviewed employment logs that placed Artman in Kent County during September 1996. His trucking company's records indicated a delivery schedule that would have required him to travel the exact route where Sharon was last seen alive. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Surveillance teams positioned themselves around Artman's current residence, documenting his routines while waiting for an opportunity to obtain DNA evidence without alerting him to the investigation. The sample needed to be legally obtained to ensure admissibility in court proceedings that would follow if the match proved positive. Psychological profiling suggested Artman fit the behavioral pattern of an organized serial killer, someone who selected victims carefully, planned attacks methodically, and disposed of evidence with calculated precision. His profession provided ideal cover for a predator seeking vulnerable targets across multiple jurisdictions. The investigation was approaching its climax after more than 2 decades of patient detective work and technological advancement. The breakthrough came during routine surveillance, when Artman discarded a coffee cup at a truck stop outside Grand Rapids. Evidence technicians recovered the cup within minutes, maintaining chain of custody that would be crucial for court proceedings. The sample was submitted for emergency DNA analysis that would determine whether 26 years of investigation had finally identified Sharon's killer. Laboratory results confirmed what investigators had hoped and dreaded in equal measure. Gary Dean Artman's genetic profile matched the evidence collected from Sharon Hammock's 1996 murder, with statistical certainty that eliminated any possibility of coincidence or laboratory error. DNA analysis showed matches at 13 genetic markers, far exceeding the standard required for criminal conviction, and reaching levels of certainty typically reserved for paternity testing. The preservation of Sharon's evidence had enabled science to speak across decades with absolute clarity that would be unshakable in court. Prosecutors reviewed the case file in preparation for charges that would finally bring Artman to justice for crimes that had haunted Kent County for more than a quarter-century. The DNA evidence was supplemented by circumstantial connections that created a comprehensive case: his presence in the area, his history of violence against women, and his profession that provided access to vulnerable victims. Local media began reporting on a major breakthrough in the 1996 Sharon Hammock murder case, though details remained limited pending arrest and formal charges. Community members who remembered the case felt a mixture of relief and frustration that justice had required so many years to materialize. Sharon's family received advance notification before public announcement, preparing them for renewed attention and the emotional complexity of seeing their daughter's case reach resolution. Their grief was complicated by vindication. Sharon's death had not been forgotten, and her killer would finally face consequences. Detective teams prepared arrest warrants while coordinating with multiple jurisdictions where Artman might be connected to additional crimes. The investigation was expanding beyond Sharon's case toward potential serial violence that had never been properly recognized. The arrest was conducted on a quiet Tuesday morning in May 2022, executed with precision that reflected months of planning and preparation. Artman was located at his residence, showing no surprise when authorities identified themselves and explained the reason for their visit. His detachment was unsettling, as if he had expected this moment for years and prepared himself psychologically for its inevitable arrival. During initial questioning, Artman exercised his right to remain silent, offering no confessions, explanations, or expressions of remorse. Detectives presented him with evidence connecting him to Sharon's murder, but he remained expressionless, almost bored by proceedings that would determine the rest of his life. His calm demeanor suggested someone accustomed to controlling situations through intimidation and violence. Now facing irrefutable DNA evidence and the full weight of the legal system, his usual tactics were powerless to influence the outcome. Investigators continued building their case while Artman remained in custody without bond. Additional DNA comparisons were conducted against unsolved murders in other jurisdictions where his trucking routes had taken him during the 1990s. Disturbing patterns emerged that linked him to at least 3 other victims. Prosecutors filed formal charges for rape and murder, though the rape charge reflected the violent nature of Sharon's death rather than traditional sexual assault. Legal language was carefully chosen to respect victim dignity while meeting statutory requirements for maximum penalties. Media coverage intensified as details emerged about Artman's history and potential connections to other cold cases. Sharon's story, finally, received the attention it deserved, though 26 years too late for her family to experience justice, without the burden of decades spent wondering. The legal process was beginning, but truth had finally emerged from silence that had protected Artman for more than half his adult life. Preparation for trial consumed months, as prosecutors built a case designed to secure conviction while honoring Sharon's memory with dignity and respect. The courtroom would become a theater where science, law, and human grief intersected in pursuit of justice that had been delayed but not denied. Artman's defense team faced the challenging task of confronting DNA evidence that was virtually unshakable. Their strategy focused on questioning evidence preservation, suggesting possible contamination, and arguing that the passage of time had compromised witness reliability. These challenges seemed weak against the overwhelming forensic proof. Prosecutors prepared a methodical presentation that would begin with crime scene evidence and build systematically toward DNA analysis. Each piece of testimony was designed to create an unbreakable chain of proof that would leave no reasonable doubt about Artman's guilt. Sharon's family prepared victim impact statements that would finally allow them to speak directly to their daughter's killer. 26 years of grief, anger, and unanswered questions would be channeled into words that might help a jury understand the human cost of Artman's violence. Media attention reached national levels, as the case attracted coverage from true crime documentaries, podcasts, and news organizations fascinated by cold cases solved through genetic genealogy. Sharon's story became symbolic of justice delayed but ultimately delivered through scientific advancement. Community members who had followed the case since 1996 prepared to attend trial proceedings, finally witnessing resolution of a mystery that had shaped local consciousness for decades. The courthouse became a pilgrimage destination for those seeking closure. Jury selection would be crucial for a case involving violence against a vulnerable woman whose life circumstances might influence public perception. Prosecutors needed jurors who could see past Sharon's struggles to recognize her fundamental humanity and right to justice. The stage was set for a legal reckoning that would determine whether truth could overcome time. The trial began with opening statements that framed 26 years of unanswered questions, finally confronting scientific certainty that could not be denied or explained away. Prosecutors outlined a case built on preserved evidence, technological advancement, and the persistence of investigators who had refused to let Sharon's memory fade into bureaucratic indifference. The courtroom was packed with Sharon's family, investigators who had worked her case across multiple decades, and community members drawn by the promise of long-delayed justice. Media coverage was extensive, reflecting public fascination with cold cases solved through genetic genealogy and the broader implications for other unsolved crimes. Artman sat impassively at the defense table, showing no emotional response as prosecutors described Sharon's violent death and its aftermath in clinical but devastating detail. His indifference was striking, almost theatrical in its coldness, as if he were watching someone else's trial, rather than facing judgment for his own actions. The prosecution's strategy was methodical and inexorable, beginning with crime scene evidence and moving systematically through 26 years of investigation toward DNA analysis that would prove guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Each piece of testimony built toward the inevitable conclusion that science had identified Sharon's killer with certainty that approached mathematical proof. A crucial moment came when prosecutors introduced evidence about the electric blanket fibers. Laboratory analysis had connected fabric samples to materials once sold exclusively in Artman's home state during the relevant time period, providing additional circumstantial support for the DNA evidence that formed the case's foundation. Defense arguments focused on the passage of time and potential contamination of evidence, but these challenges seemed increasingly desperate against the overwhelming forensic proof. The defense team appeared to be going through motions rather than mounting a serious challenge to prosecution evidence. Justice was finally within sight after decades of patient waiting and scientific advancement that had given voice to victims who could no longer speak for themselves. DNA analysts took the witness stand with calm authority earned through years of testifying in high-stakes criminal cases. Their role was to translate complex scientific concepts into language that jurors could understand and trust, explaining the technology that had bridged 26 years of silence between crime and justice. The genetic evidence was overwhelming in its clarity and precision. 13 matching markers created statistical probabilities that defied any possibility of coincidence or misidentification. The chain of custody documentation showed meticulous preservation from 1996 through 2022, eliminating contamination concerns that might otherwise compromise the evidence. Jurors listened intently as DNA analyst explained how genetic genealogy had identified Artman through family connections spanning multiple generations and geographic regions. The process was complex but undeniable. Science had spoken with absolute clarity that could not be challenged or explained away. The probability of this DNA profile belonging to anyone other than Mr. Artman is approximately 1 in 847 billion, DNA analysts testified, their voice carrying the weight of mathematical certainty. There are not enough people on Earth for this to be a coincidence. Defense attorneys cross-examined aggressively, challenging every technical detail and procedural step, but the evidence remained unshakable under scrutiny. DNA analysis had evolved far beyond the primitive techniques available in 1996, but the fundamental science was solid and the conclusions irrefutable. Public gallery reactions were visible as the testimony's implications became clear to everyone present. Sharon's family wept quietly, finally hearing scientific confirmation of what they had hoped for decades. Justice was no longer a possibility that might never arrive, it was a certainty that was finally materializing. Community members who had followed the case since 1996 felt vindication for their persistent faith in eventual resolution. Truth had emerged from the longest silence, proving that time could preserve justice alongside pain when evidence was protected and science was given the chance to evolve. Prosecutors closing. Arguments transformed Sharon from case number into human being, a mother preparing for her third child, a daughter loved by family, a woman whose life had been stolen by calculated violence that demanded accountability. The courtroom listened in respectful silence as her story was finally told with dignity and compassion. Sharon Hammock was not forgotten, prosecutor declared, voice carrying emotional weight that reflected years of preparation for this moment. Her DNA was preserved with extraordinary care. Her case was investigated with unwavering persistence. Her killer was identified through science and determination that spanned decades. Today, we speak for Sharon when she cannot speak for herself. The presentation carefully avoided exploiting Sharon's struggles, while acknowledging the circumstances that had placed her in danger. Poverty and addiction were described as vulnerabilities exploited by a predator rather than character flaws deserving moral judgment. Sharon's humanity was emphasized over her circumstances. Artman's history of violence was presented systematically, a pattern of escalating aggression that had culminated in murder when his other crimes went unpunished. His profession as a long-haul trucker had provided perfect cover for selecting victims and avoiding detection across multiple jurisdictions. The defendant chose victims he thought society wouldn't miss, prosecutor continued. Women struggling with addiction, women working in dangerous circumstances to survive, women whose deaths might not prompt extensive investigations or sustained media attention. He was wrong about Sharon Hammock. Defense arguments seemed hollow against the mountain of evidence that had accumulated over 26 years. DNA analysis, circumstantial connections, and behavioral patterns all pointed toward guilt that could not be reasonably disputed. Jurors retired for deliberation with clear instructions about the evidence required for conviction. The DNA testimony alone was sufficient for guilty verdict, but additional circumstances reinforced the prosecution's case beyond any possibility of doubt. Community members gathered outside the courthouse, waiting for verdict that would close a painful chapter of local history. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before reaching unanimous verdict that surprised no one who had followed the evidence presented during trial. Guilty on all charges, murder in the first degree and criminal sexual conduct. The conviction was overwhelming, supported by evidence that admitted no alternative explanation or reasonable doubt. Artman showed no reaction as the verdict was read aloud in a courtroom packed with observers who had waited decades for this moment. His emotional detachment continued even when facing life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The absence of remorse was striking confirmation of the calculated nature of his crimes and his fundamental indifference to human suffering. Sharon's family wept openly as justice finally arrived, after 26 years of waiting, wondering, and hoping against hope that truth would eventually emerge from silence. Their relief was complicated by grief for time lost and questions that would never be answered about Sharon's final moments. Community reaction was strong but subdued, reflecting the complex emotions surrounding justice delayed. Headlines declared, "Justice for Sharon Hammock," after 26 years, though many residents wondered why resolution had required more than a quarter-century to achieve. Detectives who had worked Sharon's investigation attended the trial as observers, finally seeing their preserved evidence fulfill its ultimate purpose. The DNA sample collected with such care in 1996 had become the voice Sharon could no longer use to identify her killer and demand accountability. Media coverage was extensive, reflecting public fascination with cold cases and genetic genealogy technology that was revolutionizing criminal justice. Sharon's story became a symbol of persistence, scientific advancement, and the possibility that truth could emerge from even the longest silence. The trial was over, but its implications would resonate through law enforcement agencies and families of other victims for years to come. Justice had been served, though it could never restore what violence had stolen from those who loved Sharon Hammock. Sentencing day arrived, with heavy finality that settled over the courthouse like morning fog. Judge presided over proceedings that would determine Artman's fate, while providing closure for Sharon's family after decades of uncertainty. The courtroom was again packed with observers drawn by the case's resolution and the broader implications for cold case investigations. Victim impact statements allowed Sharon's relatives to address her killer directly for the first time since his arrest. Her mother, now in her 70s, spoke with quiet dignity about 26 years spent wondering, hoping, and grieving for a daughter whose death had shaped every subsequent day of their lives. Sharon was not just a case number or statistic, her mother testified, voice trembling but determined. She was our daughter, a loving mother to her children, a person who was trying to build a better life, despite the challenges she faced. She deserved to live, to see her children grow up, to hold the baby she was carrying. Her sister described the impact of Sharon's unsolved murder on their family's ability to heal and move forward. Holidays became reminders of absence. Birthdays marked time passing without resolution. Every news story about similar crimes reopened wounds that couldn't properly heal without justice. Sharon's children, now adults with families of their own, spoke about growing up without their mother and the sibling they never met. Their statements were powerful testimonies to lives shaped by violence they were too young to understand, but old enough to carry as permanent burden. Judge listened to family statements with appropriate gravity, before addressing Artman directly about the crimes that had brought him before the court. The sentence was life imprisonment without possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again threaten innocent lives or escape accountability for his actions. Artman remained silent throughout sentencing, offering no apologies, explanations, or acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. His refusal to accept responsibility added insult to decades of injury, denying Sharon's family even the minimal comfort of remorse. Prosecutors revealed that additional investigations were ongoing, examining Artman's potential connections to other unsolved murders along his trucking routes. His conviction in Sharon's case might be the first of several prosecutions for crimes that had remained hidden across multiple jurisdictions. As Artman was led away in shackles to begin a prison sentence that would end only with his death, Sharon's family finally felt the weight of uncertainty lifted from their shoulders. Justice had arrived, though it could never restore what violence had stolen or repair the damage that time had inflicted. The courtroom emptied slowly, participants reluctant to abandon this moment of resolution that had seemed impossible for so many years. News of Artman's conviction spread quickly through Grand Rapids and Kent County, reaching residents who had followed Sharon's case since its beginning, and others who were learning her story for the first time. Former detectives who had worked the investigation reflected on the persistence and scientific advancement that had finally rewarded decades of patient evidence preservation. Community members gathered in coffee shops and restaurants to discuss the case's implications for other unsolved murders involving vulnerable women. The conviction sparked broader conversations about society's treatment of victims marginalized by poverty and addiction, highlighting uncomfortable truths about whose deaths received attention and whose were forgotten. Detective teams across the Midwest began reviewing cold case files for potential connections to Artman's documented trucking routes. Genetic genealogy companies reported increased requests for analysis of preserved DNA from unsolved murders, as law enforcement agencies recognized the technology's potential for addressing massive backlogs of cold cases. Sharon's children spoke publicly for the first time since the conviction, sharing memories of their mother that emphasized her warmth and love, rather than the circumstances that had led to her death. Their statements helped humanize Sharon beyond the case details, revealing the person behind the evidence and the family destroyed by violence. Media coverage extended beyond local outlets, as Sharon's story attracted national attention from true crime documentaries, podcasts, and news organizations. Her case became a featured example of justice delayed but not denied, inspiring hope for families awaiting resolution of their own tragedies. The successful use of genetic genealogy in Sharon's case became a talking point for law enforcement training programs nationwide. Her story proved that meticulous evidence collection and preservation could speak across decades when technology eventually caught up with investigative needs. Community healing began slowly, marked by recognition that justice could emerge from even the longest silence when combined with scientific advancement and institutional persistence. The resolution of Sharon's case provided hope that other cold cases might eventually find similar resolution. Her legacy extended far beyond individual justice to inspire systematic changes in how society approached forgotten victims and unsolved crimes. 6 months after his conviction, Gary Dean Artman died in prison under circumstances that remained officially undisclosed. Medical complications were cited as the cause, though details were kept private in accordance with institutional policies and family privacy requests. His death ended any possibility of confessions that might have provided closure for other victims' families. Investigators working cold cases connected to Artman's trucking routes expressed frustration at losing their only potential source for information about additional crimes. His silence had been consistent throughout arrest, trial, and incarceration, offering no insights into other potential victims or unsolved murders. Sharon's family received official notification of Artman's death with mixed emotions that reflected the complex nature of delayed justice. Relief that he could never harm anyone else was tempered by frustration that questions would remain forever unanswered about the extent of his crimes. The investigation into Artman's other potential crimes continued despite his death, as DNA evidence and circumstantial connections suggested involvement in several unsolved murders. Prosecutors could no longer pursue charges, but families of other possible victims deserved answers, even if criminal justice was no longer possible. Law enforcement agencies began sharing information more systematically, recognizing that mobile predators required coordinated responses across jurisdictional boundaries. Sharon's case became a catalyst for improved cooperation and communication between departments that had previously operated in isolation. Prison records showed that Artman had received minimal correspondence and no visitors during his brief incarceration. His isolated death reflected a life spent avoiding meaningful human connections, while exploiting vulnerable people for violent purposes. Truth had finally emerged about Sharon's murder, establishing legal and moral accountability for Artman's crimes. However, broader truth about his other potential victims would remain partially buried with his death, leaving some families without complete resolution. The pursuit of justice had achieved its primary goal, while highlighting the ongoing challenges of investigating serial violence across multiple jurisdictions and decades. Kent County launched a comprehensive cold case DNA initiative, directly inspired by Sharon's successful resolution and funded by federal grants designed to address the massive backlog of unsolved crimes. Hundreds of preserved evidence samples from cases dating back to the 1970s were submitted for genetic genealogy analysis. The program attracted national attention as a model for addressing cold case backlogs that had accumulated in law enforcement agencies nationwide. Other jurisdictions began implementing similar initiatives, recognizing genetic genealogy's potential for solving cases that had seemed permanently hopeless. Sharon's case was featured prominently in training programs for new investigators, demonstrating the critical importance of evidence preservation and meticulous documentation. Her story became required reading for forensic students, learning about long-term evidence management and the evolution of investigative technology. Families of other victims found new hope in genetic genealogy's expanding capabilities and decreasing costs. Support groups formed to help relatives navigate the emotional complexities of reopened investigations and the possibility of delayed justice that might arrive decades after their losses. Scientists working in genetic genealogy reported significant advances in analyzing degraded DNA samples that had previously yielded insufficient results. Technology continued evolving at accelerating pace, promising resolution for even more cold cases in future years. Public awareness of genetic genealogy grew beyond law enforcement applications as consumer DNA testing increased dramatically. People recognized their potential role in solving historic crimes through family tree connections that might identify suspects through distant relatives. Sharon's legacy extended far beyond her individual case to inspire systematic changes in how society approached justice for forgotten victims. Her story demonstrated that persistence, science, and proper evidence preservation could overcome even the longest silence. The initiative launched in her memory would eventually solve dozens of additional cold cases, providing closure for families who had waited years or decades for answers about their loved ones' deaths. A memorial service was organized on the 5th anniversary of Artman's conviction, bringing together community members, investigators, and Sharon's family at the rural site where her body had been discovered in 1996. The location had been transformed from a scene of violence into a place of remembrance and reflection. Candles flickered in the evening wind as participants shared memories and reflections about Sharon's life and the long journey toward justice. Her children spoke about their mother's love and their gratitude that her story had finally been told with dignity rather than judgment. Former investigators attended the ceremony, representing decades of commitment to seeking truth and maintaining hope when logic suggested surrender. Their persistence had enabled science to speak for Sharon when she could no longer speak for herself. Local officials announced plans for a memorial garden dedicated to victims of unsolved crimes, with Sharon's case prominently featured as an example of justice delayed but ultimately delivered. The space would honor all those whose deaths had been forgotten or minimized by society. Current investigators described how Sharon's case had influenced their approach to evidence preservation and cold case management. Her story had become a teaching tool that emphasized the importance of maintaining hope and continuing investigation, even when immediate resolution seemed impossible. Media coverage of the memorial focused on community, healing, and the broader implications of genetic genealogy for cold case resolution nationwide. Sharon's story continued, inspiring hope for families awaiting justice and demonstrating the value of persistent investigation. The gathering concluded with a moment of silence for Sharon and her unborn child, whose deaths had catalyzed changes that might prevent future tragedies and ensure that no victim would be truly forgotten. Evening darkness settled over the memorial site, but truth had finally illuminated shadows that had hidden Artman's crimes for decades. The success of genetic genealogy in solving Sharon's case prompted national discussions about expanding DNA databases, improving evidence preservation protocols, and allocating resources for cold case investigations. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing their unsolved files with renewed optimism and systematic approaches. Academic researchers studied Sharon's case as an exemplary demonstration of how technological advancement could resurrect seemingly impossible investigations. Her story appeared in criminology textbooks, forensic science journals, and legal publications as a case study in persistence and scientific innovation. Identifinders International experienced dramatic growth as agencies worldwide sought their expertise for cold case analysis. The company established new partnerships with law enforcement organizations and expanded their capacity to handle increasing demand for genetic genealogy services. Legal precedents established through Sharon's case influenced prosecution strategies in other genetic genealogy investigations. Courts became increasingly comfortable with the technology's reliability and admissibility, streamlining future prosecutions of cold case suspects. Victim advocacy groups cited Sharon's story when lobbying for increased funding for cold case investigations and victim services. Her successful resolution demonstrated the tangible value of investing in long-term justice efforts, even when immediate results seemed unlikely. Training programs for new investigators emphasized the lessons learned from Sharon's case, the critical importance of meticulous evidence collection, proper storage protocols, and persistent follow-up, despite apparent dead ends and shifting priorities. Public trust in law enforcement's ability to solve old crimes increased significantly as genetic genealogy successes accumulated across the country. Sharon's case represented hope that truth could emerge from any silence, regardless of duration or complexity. The technological revolution that had given Sharon's case new life continued expanding, promising additional breakthroughs for families still waiting for answers about their loved ones' deaths. The final reflection returns to that September morning in 1996, when highway workers discovered Sharon's body wrapped in an electric blanket along County Road 37. The rural Kent County roadway appears unchanged to casual observers, quiet, ordinary, unremarkable to passing travelers who have no knowledge of its tragic history. But everything is fundamentally different now. The site where violence once deposited its carefully concealed secret has become sacred ground, where truth finally spoke after 26 years of silence. The DNA sample collected with such extraordinary care has fulfilled its ultimate purpose, giving voice to someone who could no longer speak for herself. Sharon Hammock's name is no longer confined to case files, evidence boxes, and the private grief of her family. Her story has been told with dignity and respect, her death acknowledged with justice, and her memory preserved as a symbol of persistence, triumphing over time. The investigation that began with unanswerable questions in 1996 concluded with scientific certainty in 2022. 26 years of institutional silence were broken by genetic genealogy, technological advancement, and absolute refusal to accept that some truths must remain forever buried. As investigators close Sharon's file for the final time, the preserved DNA vial sits archived as a powerful symbol of what patience, science, and human determination can accomplish when combined with proper evidence preservation. Justice delayed became justice delivered, proving that time cannot forever conceal truth when people refuse to surrender hope. Sharon's legacy extends far beyond her individual case to inspire systematic changes in how society approaches forgotten victims and unsolved crimes. Her story continues through everyone committed to ensuring that no death goes unnoticed, no victim goes unmourned, and no truth stays buried forever. The electric blanket that once concealed her body became evidence that exposed her killer. The road where she was abandoned became a memorial to persistence. The silence that protected Artman for decades became testimony to the power of science and determination. Justice remembered, justice served, justice for Sharon Hammock and her unborn child.